lots of you, sorry, I'm sure lots of you have places like this in your yards and your lands and your neighborhoods, where you really get to see where the water goes and where the wetlands are and where they want to be in spring. So obviously, wetlands are really important. After centuries of policies that led to wetland drainage and impacts and land reclamation, we've started to appreciate all of the ecosystem services that natural wetlands provide. Not only are they habitat for all sorts of different plants and animals that you can see with your eyes, they also serve a lot of sort of invisible functions. And one of the most important invisible functions, and the one that we're going to talk about today, is their natural capacity to filter water and clean up pollution. They sometimes connect almost like a sponge, or even sometimes they're called maybe the kidneys of the landscape. This is really relevant, especially here in Ohio. The image on the top left here is one that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. This is an aerial image of the western basin of Lake Erie with its, luxurious and almost painterly harmful algal bloom. This one is from August 3rd, 2014. And as many of you here know, there are reoccurring harmful algal blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie. Many of you may also be familiar with the image on the right here. This is the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So excess nutrients feeding the Gulf of Mexico cause algae to grow. When that algae dies, the bacteria that decompose that algae use up so much of the oxygen in the water that large areas of the Gulf of Mexico become very low oxic or anoxic. This area is so large, they measure it on the order of states, right? So they'll say, okay, this year, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico is the size of Connecticut or Rhode Island or bigger. So these are really persistent problems on really large scales. And the culprit is often excess nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, elements that every living thing desperately needs to survive, including plants, including us, including and especially the crops that we grow to feed the world. When too much of those nutrients end up in the wrong place, though, they're too much of a good thing, and they can cause these algal blooms and dead zones, not only in large, regionally conspicuous or continentally conspicuous places, but often in more familiar places in our backyard. So I'm sure, especially people living in Ohio, right, pretty much anywhere where people live, this is sort of an unintended consequence of the way we make our livings, is sometimes extra nutrients get into ditches and streams and lakes and ponds, and they cause eutrophication. So this unwanted growth of algae and duckweed and other plant material, sometimes which just takes away the oxygen from the water, making it an unhealthy place for creatures to live. And also sometimes that actually produce toxins, making them unhealthy places, not only for creatures, but for humans and their pets. So this has been a persistent problem for a really long time. And recently, as many of you are probably aware, the governor, Mike DeWine of Ohio, and the legislature of Ohio initiated a comprehensive effort to try and mitigate these pervasive water quality problems. We're finishing up the first round of funding of the H2Ohio initiative. This was a really substantially and robustly funded program, and we're hoping the funding for the program continues. $172 million was invested for this first round of funding. And these resources were distributed among the three agencies that you see here to try and address water quality problems in a suite of ways. So the Ohio Department of Agriculture is taking the lead on helping producers and others implement best management practices, a range of best management practices in cultivated areas. The Ohio Environmental Protection Agency is investing in improving some of our hard infrastructure like septic systems and mitigating lead in our drinking water distribution systems. And then finally, the focus of the talk today, the Department of Natural Resources has taken the lead on implementing natural infrastructure to address this water quality issue. And by natural infrastructure, by and large, we mean wetlands, these ecosystems that can naturally filter water. So they're one of these best management practices that the H2Ohio initiative is investing in, especially to limit phosphorus loading into the western basin of Lake Erie, but hopefully to improve water quality generally. So the map that you see here, each dot on the map represents a single wetland restoration project that's being implemented by the Ohio Department of Natural Resources. This map is already out of date. This is just from December of 2022 or November of 2022. I think it represents about 120 projects. They're up to 141 projects under contract. All of the green dots that you see on this map represent restoration projects that have been completed, and all of the purple dots are ones that are under contract. Many of these are set to be completed this year. So the reason why the state of Ohio and the ODNR is investing all of this effort and all of this money into wetland restoration and construction is because of this idea that wetlands are naturally the kidneys of the landscape. So you can think of them sometimes conveniently for PowerPoint presentations, the wetlands actually shaped like a kidney. And so that can help you remember that they have this natural filtration ability, right? They slow water down. They're full of biology, plants and microbes that can chemically change forms of pollution, making them less of a contaminant, or can just stop them in their tracks and prevent them from moving downstream where they can cause problems. In the context of H2Ohio, we're specifically interested in nutrients, right? So nitrogen and phosphorus. We know that both nitrogen and phosphorus, right, the two biggest components of fertilizer, both of them contribute to eutrophication and harmful algal blooms. So ideally, we'd like to invest in systems and approaches that remove both of them. So I'm going to walk you through some of the basics of how a wetland removes nitrogen and phosphorus. So you're welcome to Dr. Kinsman-Costello's biogeochemistry class. So nitrogen and phosphorus, right, they enter a wetland via whatever flow path. Maybe it's stream, maybe it's overland flow, maybe groundwater is bringing it in, maybe it's a tile drain outlet that directly inputs into wetlands. And whatever on-field practices or best management practices have been implemented, there's still a little bit of those nutrients maybe that are leaking out and they get into a wetland. So the first and most conspicuous way that wetlands ecosystems can stop that nitrogen and phosphorus from moving downstream is just through plants uptaking them, right? Just like in fields and gardens, the plants growing in wetlands also need nitrogen and phosphorus to grow. So they can take up some of that nitrogen and phosphorus and build new leaves and build stems and build roots and prevent that nitrogen and phosphorus from moving downstream. Now, what this image doesn't show is the fact that these plants don't live forever, right? Sometimes they die and they decompose, and that nitrogen and phosphorus can be returned into the water and into the soil, maybe in a different chemical form, but not permanently completely removed. So plant storage is a really important part of the way that wetlands remove nitrogen and phosphorus, but it's not the only way, and it's probably not even the most important way. For nitrogen and phosphorus, the ways that wetlands more permanently remove these nutrients and the ways that wetlands probably remove more of these nutrients happen in the soil, in the muck under the water that you don't actually see in this picture. And it's two pretty different processes for these two different nutrients, because nitrogen and phosphorus are elements that are chemically very different. So the main way that nitrogen is removed from the system is through a microbial mediated process called denitrification. So these are bacteria that live in the mud that basically when oxygen goes away, they can kind of breathe nitrate. And so they transform that nitrate in the water into nitrogen gas, and it's completely removed from the system and it is not going downstream. So this is a really ideal situation when we're trying to mitigate nitrogen pollution. Phosphorus, on the other hand, it doesn't have any major gas form that's relevant in the ecosystems we're looking at. So the main ways that wetlands stop phosphorus moving downstream is just by stopping it in the soil. The lucky situation is that the kind of phosphorus that feeds algal blooms is really sticky. So it sticks to soil surfaces through sorption processes. And sometimes phosphorus is carried into wetlands and ecosystems already glommed on to particles and bits of mud and soil that maybe have eroded. And when those particles get to a wetland and they slow down, they can become buried, right? So we've got these two very different processes removing nitrogen and phosphorus. Denitrification is a really biological, microbially mediated process that occurs best when oxygen is absent. Whereas for phosphorus, we have physical settling, burial of the particles, and geochemical sorption, which actually occurs best when there is oxygen in the soil. So different processes, and you can already see that maybe there is some trade-offs. Perhaps a system or part of a system that's really effective at removing nitrogen might not be as effective at removing phosphorus at different times, and vice versa. And that's a really important thing to remember. The processing rates individually for each of these different nutrients vary in space and time. Different wetlands may have different capacities for removing nitrogen and phosphorus. As a wetland changes over time, their ability to do these functions can vary, and comparing different parts within a wetland even. And another extremely important piece to remember when we think about the ability of wetlands to remove nutrients is that it depends on how connected the system is to the landscape. I mentioned earlier, maybe a tile drain is inputting some excess nitrogen and phosphorus into the wetland. Well, if a wetland isn't receiving that nitrogen and phosphorus to begin with, it can't remove very much of it and prevent it from going downstream. So the ability of a wetland to remove nutrients depends on the way that wetland is connected to the landscape. So wetlands are the kidneys of the landscape, right? Right. But we have to remember that their ability to remove pollution varies. This is something I didn't mention earlier, but it's a really important thing to know is that at times, not very often, but it can happen, some wetlands can actually become a source for nutrients rather than a sink. This is especially a concern in areas that have received fertilizer inputs in the past that have accumulated a lot of phosphorus in the soil. Some of that phosphorus at times is actually released temporarily during wetland restoration instead of being sequestered. So that's a very real concern that needs to be mitigated. And obviously there, as I mentioned just before, there are these inherent differences in nitrogen and phosphorus, and we really want to get at both. Here's just a graph demonstrating that issue of phosphorus release. So this is a wetland that I studied in Southeast Michigan during my dissertation. And this graph is showing the concentration of phosphorus in the surface water of the wetland after it was reflooded. So the red line is when the restoration happened. All the blue dots represent places that were ditches prior to the restoration, and all the green dots represent places that are new baby wetlands that were reflooded as part of this restoration. And you see, at least during the first year of this restoration, the concentration of phosphorus in the surface water was really high. And we think that some of this was actually exported downstream. That rate of export obviously declined over time, but this is something that kind of has raised some red flags for people interested in wetland restoration for removing nutrients, and something that we really want to be aware of. And so that leads us to these questions, right? Knowing all of this now, we want to know, how effective is wetland restoration compared to other best management practices at removing nutrients? What role can it play? And probably more importantly, we know that wetlands are going to play an important role, but how do we effectively manage wetland restoration into the future in terms of the kinds of restoration projects that we invest in terms of ways of mitigating this potential for phosphorus release, or at least predicting it, because it doesn't happen all the time. And it's not enough of a reason to not restore wetlands at all. And that leads us to the H2Ohio Wetland Monitoring Program. So this is a science-based monitoring program that's being funded through a fraction of the ODNR's H2Ohio initiative budget to the Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Network, which is a consortium of aquatic scientists, including myself, that Chris Winslow is going to tell you a little bit more about at the end of my talk. So we're a group of scientists from 6 universities throughout the state of Ohio, and wetlands are really complicated systems. And so we need a lot of different experts to assess different parts of the system and understand how they fit together. So we have hydrologists, soil scientists, plant scientists, and everything in between. And I just always have to highlight the fact that not only do we have a really strong team of faculty scientists, but we're a team of over 30 staff and students all working together to assess the effectiveness of these wetland projects. And the reason why it's important to invest in a new kind of monitoring program is that up until now, most of the existing large-scale wetland monitoring programs really have been put there for regulatory compliance. Do they meet requirements of permitting, contractual performance, ecosystem health and integrity? And to do that, they directly observe things like plant biodiversity and substrate characteristics and how large the wetland is, right? All of those visible features of wetlands that demonstrate whether or not it is a healthy ecosystem providing valuable habitat and whether or not it actually is a wetland. Does it hold water? Now, it assumes that these invisible nitrogen and phosphorus removal functions are happening, and it also assumes that these functions are stable, that after a project is complete, if you go in a year or 2 years later and you see that wetland plants are growing there and that water is being held, there is an assumption that these nutrient removal processes are happening. But with the level of investment of H2Ohio and the societal importance of actually achieving our targets at cleaning up nitrogen and phosphorus, and the knowledge that wetland ability to do this really varies, we're trying to do better and make these processes more visible by more directly assessing these nutrient removal processes in the H2Ohio implemented wetlands. So we're trying to support not only the evaluation of these individual projects that the state is investing in, but also inform future activities. So how do we do that? How do we actually measure those invisible processes that I mentioned to you earlier? Well, one really basic way, and this is what's often done related to that sort of invisible assessment, is just assuming, based on research that's been done in the past, that a certain area of wetland will remove a certain amount of nitrogen and phosphorus. And that's what's been done. Often when you see estimates of phosphorus load reduction or nitrogen load reduction for a wetland project, it's based on values that have been directly measured in other systems, not in that system. You can also kind of take soil from the system and measure directly those specific processes that I measured. So, you might want to take a hunk of soil from the middle of this pond and see, okay, how much nitrate does it remove? How much phosphorus sticks to it? But that's always going to be affected by lab conditions. And whenever you take a hunk of soil from a wetland, how do you know that it's acting the same as the soil from a different part of the wetland? And finally, you maybe know what that bit of soil does, but you don't know what the whole system does as a whole because you don't know how it's connected to the landscape. Or finally, you can directly quantify the amount of nutrient load that's being reduced by directly measuring the nutrient inputs and the outputs to estimate a nutrient budget. this is kind of like treating a wetland like your bank account. And just like your bank account, you want less going out than coming in this framework. And so we're at the monitoring program kind of see this as almost the holy grail. It's difficult to do, but it's the most policy relevant measure of nutrient removal because it gives you an actual mass of nutrient removed per acre per year, perhaps. And then that can support cost benefit analysis. You can compare the performance of a single wetland as it changes over time. You can compare different wetlands to one another within a common framework. And you can compare wetland restorations to other BMPs to understand kind of what component of nutrient removal are all of these different interventions contributing to our overall goal of minimizing nutrient flow into vulnerable freshwater systems. So that is what we are going to try to do. We call this the mass balance approach, right? And the idea is that if you measure the concentration of a nutrient entering a wetland, the one I'm showing you here is the Old Woman Creek wetland, which I like to think of as one of the poster child of Ohio wetlands. It's one of the few remaining unchanged, or at least unstructurally changed coastal wetlands along the coast of Lake Erie, and it's been demonstrated to be really effective at removing nutrients because of this kind of mass balance study. So we can measure the concentration of nutrients going in, we can measure the amount of water going in and the amount of water going out, and that gives us the total amount of a nutrient entering or leaving the wetland, right? And again, and then when we do look at the difference between those, that's our mass balance, the balance of mass of nutrients. A positive mass balance means that nutrients were removed and the ecosystem, in ecosystem ecology lingo, we call that a sink for that nutrients. If it's negative, it means that nutrient was released and the ecosystem is a net source. Obviously, we want the first and not the former. And again, as I mentioned earlier, when we can get at that estimate of perhaps pounds of phosphorus removed, we could even compare that to the cost of a given project and even put some sort of economic value on it. So this is our goal where we can do it, but it's not straightforward. It actually takes a lot of work. Even in wetlands that have relatively easy to measure, like maybe even a pipe is going in and a pipe is going out, and you can measure 100% of the water going in, 100% of the water going out, and all the nutrients. It's still a lot of data collection. And the reality is that most wetlands in the world, and especially most wetlands being restored as part of H2Ohio, don't have these clean inflows and outflows. A lot of really important wetlands are coastal, where maybe they're connected to Lake Erie or another large water body, and you have water sloshing in and sloshing out, moving in two different directions. So understanding what's going in and what's going out at different times is challenging. In a floodplain wetland, where you have a wetland adjacent to maybe a large river or a stream, and every now and then the flooding of that water body floods the banks, measuring sort of the amount of water and what's in that water going in and out becomes more challenging. And then of course we have wetlands that don't have any obvious surface water connection. Maybe there's just overland flow running off into it. Maybe they have connections with groundwater that are difficult to see. So you name it, we've got it in the H2Ohio wetland restoration portfolio. Different wetlands require different approaches for nutrient budgeting, even though our goal is still to get at these as direct as possible estimates of nutrient reduction. So I wish we were always monitoring these cartoon wetlands where it's basically a box with some plants in it and some water and a pipe going in and a pipe going out, but that's just not realistic. We now have, like I said, 141 projects in our portfolio, which is a lot of wetlands, and they're extremely different. So some have a lot of earth moving involved and alterations to the landscape. Some involve just disruption of tile drains that were in the land when it was cultivated prior to its restoration. Obviously, we have some coastal projects. Some projects are really highly engineered and do have really constrained and controlled inflows and outflows. So as an ecosystem scientist, if you came up to me and you said, design a project to understand how effective wetland restoration is at nutrient removal, a scientist would never design a project like this because of how many different kinds of sites there are. But in our minds, this is actually one of the strengths of the opportunity to monitor these diverse wetlands, because each one of these projects represents how a real wetland restoration project is actually implemented on the ground. So we're getting one of the most realistic windows into the effectiveness of wetland restoration that we're aware of, especially with so many different projects and different kinds of projects being evaluated under the same framework. Now, because of that challenge, we can't just set up a monitoring station at the inflow of the wetland and a monitoring station at the outflow of the wetland and call it a day, because many don't have inflows and outflows. And also that pretty much puts that wetland in a black box. It doesn't tell us what's going on. So we're designing our monitoring program to not only look at what's going in and what's going out, but to monitor all of the components of the wetland system that might influence its ability to clean up nitrogen and phosphorus. We're looking at the hydrology of the system, which is critically important, the nutrients that are stored in plants, what kind of plants are there, the nutrients that are stored in soils and how stuck or unstuck those nutrients can be. And this helps us understand that nutrient budget when it's not a straightforward in and out measurement. It also helps us understand what's happening inside the wetland. So if we wanted to build a wetland in a computer, basically build a model of a wetland and see how it responds to different kinds of scenarios, we can only do that if we understand how the wetland is working. And so that's why we're putting together this really comprehensive approach that will not only evaluate individual projects and tell us whether or not they performed, but how they performed. And that'll help inform how we do better as we move forward. Obviously, we can't do this to a full tier everywhere we go. So we're taking what we call a tiered approach. We have a handful of really intensively monitored projects. This is 6, but we've added at least one more for 2023. Actually, I think it is up to 6 now. And this doesn't imply any kind of value of one project being better than another. We chose projects that we think are indicative of common kinds of wetland restorations. We chose projects where we have good relationships with the partners to give us access to the restoration projects and have really important information about the history of the sites. And we also chose projects that were complete in 2020 or near completion in 2020 and 2021 when we started this. All of the other projects throughout the state will sample less frequently, less intensively, and we'll try to develop low-cost indicators of nutrient function, basically looking for red flags, maybe indicators of nutrient release, and we're trying to develop what we call taking a wetlands vital sign. So in the same way a doctor, or maybe even at home, you could take your temperature and know that you have a fever without maybe knowing fully what's making you sick. You know that that's an indication of your health. We're trying to develop indicators of wetland nutrient removal function through this process. And I think I'm running low on time, so I'm going to go through this stuff really fast. This is just some preliminary data from one of our restoration sites. So this is the Forder Bridge wetland project. It's adjacent to the Maumee River. And this is one of those early indicators that we're collecting at every H2Ohio project. It's called soil phosphate sorption capacity, sometimes called soil phosphorus storage capacity. This is a measure of how sticky the soil is for phosphate and how much phosphate is already stuck to the soil. When you combine those two pieces of information, it's just based on a Mehlich 3 extraction of soil, measuring the phosphorus, the iron, and the aluminum in that extraction, and then doing a little bit of math to get at a number that tells you whether the soil has a high potential for releasing phosphorus, right? All of those sorption sites, all of the binding sites in the soil are already full of phosphate, or whether it has the capacity to sorb more phosphorus. So this is the kind of early information that we can get at H2Ohio projects before we even take in a water sample, sometimes before restoration has even happened. And it'll help us understand over time as we see how the project responds to the restoration. This will help provide us some context about maybe in other sites we can use this as a really valuable predictor of how the as-built project will function. All right, so putting it all together, this is the fun part. It's the tricky part. We have all of these different data types, and we're going to put them together to get our best possible estimate of the amount of nutrients going in, the amount of nutrients going out to estimate the nutrient budget, right? This means for a whole year, taking water samples, when it's flooded, when it's not, when it's flowing at a normal rate, when it's flowing really fast because of a storm. It means taking soil samples throughout the wetland. In some cases, it means developing a sophisticated 3D hydrodynamic model of the wetland to fully understand, is groundwater entering the wetland? How much groundwater is entering and how much goes back? And is that groundwater carrying nutrients that are then removed? When and where do large storm events affect the wetland? Things like that. We take all of that information, we do a lot of math, sometimes maybe some statistics. And the way we do this is going to be different for different wetlands, depending on the type of inflows and outflows that they have. But eventually we'll have one data point for a year. We'll say, okay, in this year, this wetland removed this much nitrogen or this much phosphorus, right? That first year, our error bars on that point are going to be really big because our data probably isn't going to be complete. But then the next year, we're going to improve our monitoring over and over and over again. And eventually, our error bars, our ability, our confidence that that data point is that actually represents the amount of nitrogen or the amount of phosphorus that was actually removed by that wetland, our confidence is going to go up and our uncertainty is going to go down. And then over time, we might even be able to predict how that wetland is going to act in the future if things continue the way they are. So this is going to take a long time. And another really important facet of our monitoring program is that we're building it as a foundation for long-term monitoring, to continue to do this year in and year out, improve our monitoring effectiveness, reduce these uncertainties, and get a sense of how these really dynamic ecosystems and brand new baby wetlands grow up into restored, functioning, nutrient removing wetlands. This is a pretty unique program. We don't know of any other program, and we've asked a lot of experts throughout the country about other wetland monitoring programs, and there aren't any other programs that are looking at so many different kinds of wetland restoration simultaneously, so many different kinds of wetlands in the first place, let alone restoration projects. We're really confident that at the end of the day, we are going to be able to say important and useful new things about wetland restoration because of this long-term monitoring plan. And we're also viewing this as a foundation for other kinds of research and other kind of monitoring, right? Because of the goals of H2Ohio, our group is 100% focused on nitrogen and phosphorus, but we know that wetlands aren't just removing nitrogen and phosphorus. They're providing habitat for plants and birds and animals. There might be sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere and mitigating climate change. With the data and the understanding that we're building about each of these restoration systems, which we are centrally managing with robust quality control, with the intent to share it broadly, we're building a foundation that other groups can come in and do monitoring about things that don't relate to nutrients or more detailed mechanistic understanding of the nutrient removal processes that we don't have the bandwidth to do in our scope. And if anybody on this call is interested, some of you may have even encountered these. Some of our H2Ohio projects already have things in place where anybody can help us collect data about the project and contribute to this monitoring program. So we have chronolog stations at some of the sites, which is, you can see in the corner of the top photo there, there's like a little, it looks like a little plastic shelf thing. You put your phone on that, you take a picture, and then that picture is uploaded, and we can track the progression of H2Ohio projects just using those images that anybody walking by. We're also establishing crowd hydrology stations, which are basically large rulers that you stick in a wetland to measure how deep they are from far away. So any wetland that has a crowd hydrology station, if you walk by and you see one of these, you can text how deep the water is to a number, and that helps us fill in gaps when we're not out there directly measuring how deep the water is. We can use crowd hydrology data, and these are our initial efforts at inviting others to help us collect data, because we have a really big job trying to monitor all of these different wetlands, and we're going to expand that in the years to come. Yeah, so this, I just really want to thank, especially the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, supporting this really valuable and unique monitoring program. We've also been fortunate to receive some additional support from the Ohio Department of Education and the US EPA Great Lakes Restoration Initiative program that are both expanding our capacity to do this monitoring and understand how different wetland restoration projects are functioning. And then I think that this is my last slide. I think that Chris Winslow is up next to talk a little bit about Learn. So as requested, Chris, here is the Learn logo.
Lauren, can you hear my audio before you mute yourself? Or
yes,
yeah, okay, good. So I'm just here to just kind of put a pin in the Learn topic. And so I love what Lauren presented. Every time I hear her speak, I learn more about the cool things that are coming out of that program. But really just wanted to drive home why Learn is here. And so this came out of an NSF planning grant that was written a handful of years ago. And the idea is to really, number one, out of the gates, was to connect all the academic resources across the state. There are great things going on in Bowling Green and Kent and Akron and Cincinnati and Ohio State, that we need to have those individuals talking more, and not just about the research, but also about, hey, you need access to this piece of equipment, I have it, or you need a boat to get here, I have a boat that can get you there. And so that was one of the major pushes, is to connect these academic institutions, which Lauren has highlighted here, again, the 6 that are working seamlessly together. But as important as connecting the academic institutions is that we found out that science for science sake is an amazing thing. And a lot of the things that Lauren talked about are going to end up in scientific journals and presented at regional science conferences. And I would ask, or say probably countrywide conferences. But what's as important is that scientific knowledge is getting that knowledge into the hands of stakeholders. And that can be people that live in those communities. But for us, what we're targeting right now, it's also to the agencies and to elected officials. We want to make sure that the information we're gleaning here can inform changes in behavior, perhaps more importantly, changes in policy and management. And so Learn exists not only to connect these academic institutions, but to bring agencies kind of under this tent. I should have introduced myself first. I'm director of Ohio Sea Grant, which is a NOAA-funded program in the state of Ohio, and director of Ohio State University Stone Laboratory. And what I found in my career wearing those 2 hats is that the agencies would benefit and want help in doing what they do. And so Learn is a mechanism to connect them to knowledge, but to students that could be hires of the future. It connects them to equipment and sampling and data that they couldn't normally access. And so that's what I wanted to really highlight with Learn. This wetland project is just one research focus currently of Learn, but we want this group to be able to be there for addressing groundwater issues, PFOS, PFOS, what is happening with pharmaceuticals and personal care products in our waters in Ohio. I would argue that not one agency, not one academic at a university can address those problems. And so that's what Learn is supposed to do. It's many hands to help out with these large global wicked problems. It's intended to be cost effective, so not buying new research equipment under a grant when it already exists within the state. And so there are a bunch of committees that sit within Learn. So behind the scenes of Learn, we're trying to figure out what the website should look like, how we should do outreach to communities and stakeholders and agencies. How do we communicate where we're doing our work and what data is collected and what data can be shared and things like that. So what I would encourage you to do is go to the website. You can type in Lake Erie and Aquatic Research Network. You can become a member, right? It's no cost, no fee. You can just type in what if you're a state agency or a federal agency person, or if you're an academic or you're at a university, just go in and put your information into this this website. And what we're trying to do is just make sure that we connect these resources across the state. So that's all I had to add to Lauren. Lauren, thank you for that presentation. It was awesome. And I turn it back to you, Courtney. I think you want to bring in the third speaker for today.
Yes, thank you guys so much. That was great. If you guys have any questions, like I said, drop those in the Q&A, and we will get those answered at the end. I am now going to hand it over to Matt Buchhop, and he's going to give us some updates on H2Ohio. Oh, you're still muted, Matt.
Okay, there we go. Hello, my name is Matthew Buchhop. I'm the Special Programs Technician at the Fulton County Soil and Water Conservation District. My main focus as part of my job is H2Ohio and assisting producers in the county sign up acres and help answer questions about how to follow the BMPs and eventually get them paid. And how I do that is, so like Lauren said, the H2Ohio initiative was launched by Governor DeWine back in 2019 with the goal to address the HABs on Lake Erie. And on the right there are the main goals: reducing phosphorus, which is what I do, creating wetlands, which is ODNR, and then addressing failing septic systems and preventing lead contamination is more of Ohio EPA's portion of the grant. Maybe. So addressing the HABs, phosphorus runoff from farm fields in the Western Lake Erie Basin, we want to stop that from making it to usually the Maumee River and then to Lake Erie. And since around 80% of the land use in the area is agricultural, it's important that that is addressed or tracked. H2Ohio is incentivizing farmers to implement proven science-based practices to reduce the risk of phosphorus runoff. That's using soil samples to determine how much should be applied, when it should be applied, where it should be applied. And then ODNR deals with the wetlands, like Lauren said, huge in filtering nutrients, and the EPA is improving infrastructure such as lead pipes. In 2022, ODA estimated that phosphorus load was reduced by nearly 290,000 pounds from pre-H2Ohio numbers. The goal is to reduce phosphorus by 1 million pounds before the life of the grant ends. And then they want to increase enrollment with streamlined BMPs, which are best management practices, and continue to decrease these loads in 2024 and 2025. Again, here are the estimated load reductions. ODNR with their wetlands, approximately 115,000 pounds. ODA with 290,000 pounds, which makes sense. Like I said, 80% of the land use is agricultural. There's just simply so much acreage through the Department of Ag that is being paid through H2Ohio. and then the EPA with 3,800 pounds. Like I said, my main job is to work directly with the farmers. They come into the office, we have meetings. I explain to them, what the management practices are. A lot of the producers I talk to are already implementing these things, which is great because then that's H2Ohio provides even further incentivization to continue doing this. And it draws in other producers who were kind of on the fence about certain practices that are now with this incentive doing these. In the area here, we have 2,400 producers enrolled with 1.5 million acres enrolled in VNMPs and 1.2 million enrolled in other practices such as cover crops or phosphorus placement. With the budget in, I believe July is when it will be hopefully approved. They would like to expand H2Ohio to the rest of the state, as well as continue funding through, I believe, 2026. The goal is to increase by 500,000 acres outside of the Western Lake Erie Basin and 2 million acres inside the Western Lake Erie Basin. You got to remember a lot of these other counties, especially Southeast Ohio, not as much agriculture going on, a lot more forested areas. Here are the best management practices. Like I said, the voluntary nutrient management plan is probably the most important. You can't really enroll in the other practices unless you start there. And that is developing a kind of a program, I guess, for each field. What soil test is there? How often are they soil tested? And then what's the planned crop rotation? And based on that information, we can determine, what nutrients should be applied when and where. And then subsurface phosphorus placement, that is the practice of injecting phosphorus underground, similarly to the manure incorporation and utilization. Both of those, the whole goal is to keep the fertilizer off the surface to prevent runoff and then prevent those nutrients from getting into the waterways. And overwintering cover crops is another huge staple of H2Ohio. And these are to reduce erosion as well as hold nutrients in the soil, again, to keep them out of the waterways. And then both of those together improve overall soil health. As part of the sign-up process, like I said, the BNMPs is the most important part. That includes field information, such as, how large is the field, where is it located? That might be, just the county or the township, or it might be, what road intersection is that at? That's especially useful if we need to go out and do cover crop checks. And then, like I said, soil tests results, the method that was used, the crop rotation and what the average yield is for that field, for that crop. And then we get into the fertilizer application timing, which is usually just the season, and the rates. And I have an example here I can show you. Up top, you have, the producer information. That's my name and phone number. And then after that, we have the field information.
Matt, we can still just see your PowerPoint. I think you need to share a different screen. No, you're fine. I think if you hit share screen and then click a different one, it should go.
Gotcha. Okay, can you see me now? Okay, cool. So up here, like I said, this is just producer information, the farmer and the contact information. And then you move here to the field information. This is usually just, what they call it, the common name. And then if they allow you, you can put the FSA farm and tract numbers. And then we have the field size and what county it's in. And then as we move down, we have the soil test results. H2Ohio regulations require all soil tests to be done within the last 4 years for them to be viable for BNMP. So this one was completed in 2021. The soil test units, it's either parts per million or pounds per acre. And then the method, usually it's Bray P1. And then the actual, these are just averages of the soil tests and then what lab completed them, if you ever have any questions. And now we get into crop rotation, yields, and the fertilizer recommendations. So the producer would go through, or they would come into the office and ask me to do this for them. We would do the years of the contract that they would like to sign up for, and then what the crop, their planned crop is at that time. Usually that changes a lot and we have to go back and redo some things, but that's fine because to do this template. Then we have the average yield, and based on the soil test, the crop, and the average yield, the form kicks out these numbers here, which are the removal / recommendation. And then those are added up to the nutrient needs and then the nutrient planned, which comes from this. This is, the producer would say, you know, based on this crop, I'm going to use these fertilizers. This is the rates, the amount, and then when and how it's going to be applied. And based on that, you want this planned nutrient to not exceed the nutrient needs. And then as long as the producer is doing that, then that would be considered following their nutrient management plan. Then we'll go back to the presentation here. Another part of H2Ohio through the Department of Ag is two-stage ditches. They recently awarded $4.2 million for 12 ditch projects. 11 of those are in the Western Lake Erie Basin, and it's about 8.4 miles of ditch projects that should benefit more than 18,000 acres of the local watershed. And those are slated to begin this summer. And if you don't know what a two-stage ditch is, here I just have a couple kind of examples. On the left, you have the basic design. It's got these grass benches that serve to help slow down water and allow that grass to absorb nutrients. And then on the right here, we have one that was recently constructed. You can see you have the main channel, which is where the water is currently flowing. And then to the right, you have that bench that leads back up to level with the crop field. And again, here's my contact information if you have any questions or think of any after today. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Matt. So if you guys have any questions, like I said, you guys can drop them in the Q&A there and we will get them asked. I do have one quick question that I thought of. So this may be for Lauren and or Matt, not sure who could answer it, but there's lots of other programs I've kind of been hearing coming about, different government funding that people can do. Do you guys think that that's going to have an impact on your enrollments in H2Ohio programs?
I will say for H2Ohio, we've already been kind of dealing with that. They built into the program from the get-go that any acres that are being paid through another government grant, such as EQIP through FSA, are not eligible for H2Ohio funds. I haven't run into that a whole lot. I think H2Ohio is pretty, I don't want to say lax with the rules, but again, it's not a federal grant. So I think that is more attractive to a lot of producers. So there's a few that I might lose to EQIP, but a lot of times it's, they might only sign up some acres for EQIP and some for H2Ohio. So far, it hasn't really been much of an issue.
I might add a little bit to that, Courtney, and that's great, Matt. Thanks for that response. But I think sometimes folks forget that the Maumee River Basin, the watershed, is 7.2 million acres. I think in Ohio alone, it's 4.3 million acres. So bring it on, right? I'm not saying that the investment we already have is not an important investment. It's exactly what we should be doing. But I think there's a lot of acres out there that could use that support. And so I think there's more acres and more want than there is money out there. And so I'm encouraged by that.
For sure. Thank you guys for those answers. We'll wait around. I'm gonna pull up the CCA credits for those of you who need those. You can scan that QR code and get those credits. We'll wait around here for if there are any other questions that come through. But thank you guys for those presentations. I think it was really great to kind of hear the options that people have to help in these practices to stop the harmful algal blooms from happening. I'm also going to launch another poll for our CLM credits. If you are here for those CLM credits, please answer that poll, yes or no. That way we can get you guys those credits. I just launched that poll. So if our participants could go ahead and answer that, we will get those credits submitted for you guys so you are able to get those for attending our webinar today. And then I will just keep an eye on our Q&A and see if any more questions come in.
Actually, Courtney, Matt, and maybe even Amber, I have a question. I know it's probably against the rules for panels, but when we talk about all these things that are being, supported through H2Ohio and other mechanisms, I'm starting to hear some conversations around cover crops and carbon sequestration, right? And so there is some discussion about, like, are farmers going to be incentivized to sequester carbon through things, right? And I'm starting to hear rumblings about people concerned that, how do we baseline what a farmer's already doing, right? So they do other things, right? They want to get compensated for that carbon sequestration, and rightfully should. I'm worried that people are going to stop doing some of these things to, like, reset the scale to be eligible for carbon sequestration credit. What are you guys hearing in that space?
I haven't really heard of any producers, I guess, trying to game the system like that. Most of the time, it's already something they were doing. So I don't know if it's a lot. I don't know if there's that many guys going into it with that mindset. I haven't heard them mention anything about carbon sequestration or anything, but we do have, I guess, in terms of a baseline, we use the Ohio OACI, which, in order to sign up for the program, is a website that they have to go to before they create their VNMPs or anything. And they have to go through and say, I guess, historically, how many acres of cover crops do you put out there each year? What fertilizer are you using? What kind of tillage equipment do you use? So I think the goal of that is to kind of establish some baseline. So hopefully, if you see major changes between, and then each year, I guess they're supposed to go and update their OACIs. So that should be a good method of tracking, hopefully.
Yeah,
I think that's the goal of it. So
I just want to make sure that as we're, these producers are just being so engaged and proactive about stacking practices and putting practices out there. I don't want to see one of these programs, the unintentional consequences of us to take a step back and go forward. So we got to really, put that effort into realizing what producers are doing to get where we're asking them to get. So just an important point to make.
I've got another question here. This may be whoever wants to take a stab at it. Can wetlands be a solution for every field, and are there any land requirements to make them work?
That's a really excellent question. I think I'm not as involved in the actions of wetland restoration. My sense is that some fields and some areas are better for wetland restoration than others. And engaging with the Ohio DNR and other soil and water conservation districts in your area to start a conversation about whether or not a wetland might be a good feature in your land is a good place to start, because wetlands like to be where wetlands were before. So places that are already sort of marginally drained, maybe historically had wetland hydrology. Basically, wetland hydrology just means they held water and they didn't drain. You know, they're wet for all or part of the year and they have inundation, like actual surface water. And places that are already kind of, the yields are poor because of that intermittent flooding, are places that are really good candidates for wetland restoration. And places that can be plumbed to receive high nutrient output can be really effective. Designing an actual wetland restoration actually takes a pretty specific skill set and expertise, and sometimes involves even sort of civil engineering and hydrologic engineering. And that's why people often identify opportunities for wetland restoration and then work with consulting firms and other partners to design and build it, because especially getting the hydrology right is really important. But what's nice is that with the H2Ohio program and with these goals, there are a lot of resources out there supporting more and more wetland restoration.
And I'll just add on to Lauren's, this is what we've been saying all along when we're working on reducing wetland isn't a wetland isn't a wetland. A farmer's field isn't a farmer's field isn't a farmer's field. And so this is the problem. We all want that silver bullet of you do these two things and problem goes away. And that's just not the reality of the situation we're in right now. But that's what I love about what Lauren presented. We don't have enough data in hand right now to help in that space. We're getting some good clues. But basically the goal is to show, of these 141 wetlands, these 80 are working great. And we think it's because they all have X, Y, and Z, where these over here that aren't working so great in the nutrient space, it's maybe because of these factors. And so the goal is to help with those decisions and those, kind of information driven, is this the right place for a wetland or isn't it? And the only caveat I'll add to that is this adds that social science component of the work we're doing right now. The science is going to tell you this is probably the best way to go, and this is maybe not the best way to go. But then I can see a situation where you have the haves and have-nots. Well, okay, so farmer Susie Jones over here and farmer Bob Smith here, Bob's going to get the money to do a wetland and Susie's not. And that's unfortunate. But again, I think we're all in this together. That's the kind of mindset we have to take, and that, some practices are going to work in some places and not in others. But hopefully what Lauren and the wetland monitoring learn team are doing will help inform those decisions of the future. And I guess, I'm sorry to take so much time on this answer, Courtney, but I would also say is, you're hearing out there right now that these wetlands are going to become saturated and then they're actually going to become future sources. Possibility. Do we think it's every wetland that eventually is going to get to that space and those sorts of things? I don't know. Lauren, I see you showing some reaction. I'd love you to weigh in.
Yeah, it doesn't happen all the time. Maybe 10% of the time, right? Enough of the time that we really need to be aware of it and go into projects with our eyes open and know what to look for, because we don't have good ways of predicting when it's going to happen. It doesn't happen enough to say we shouldn't restore wetlands on farm fields because they're a source of phosphorus, but it happens enough that that's why this monitoring program is in place. And the other piece that relates both to this and what you were talking about earlier in terms of balancing different practices for different goals, for nutrients versus climate change mitigation, every wetland that's put in there has lots of different outcomes, nutrients, as well as all of these other things, habitat, floods, carbon balance, things like that. And so moving towards a more holistic view of the impact of different actions on nutrients, habitat, global warming balance, things like that, is going to give us more and more power to implement things that move us in a positive direction on all of those fronts, and build in synergies, right? The academics call that ecosystem service synergies, and minimizing ecosystem service trade-offs, which is when you do something that is really good at providing one ecosystem service, but might actually be really bad on another sense. And then you have to weigh which is more important to you. And that's just the reality. And we're hoping that the monitoring program helps provide clear information so that policymakers, agencies, individuals can make more informed decisions about how to implement all these different things.
Wetlands will continue to be a tool in the toolbox, right? It's just where does that tool get deployed and where doesn't it? So they're a net positive. It's just we can be more thoughtful about where they go.
Awesome. I've got one more question here in the Q&A from one of our participants. Are the results from the tile discharging stations available to the public, and where could those results be found if they are published?
So our monitoring program isn't directly monitoring tile discharging stations. There are a couple of projects where there is a tile drain that's directly going into a wetland, and we're collecting water samples at those as an input to that wetland. We don't have a coordinated effort in monitoring tile discharge. Chris may be aware of other coordinated efforts. And as an aside, we are developing our data management and sharing framework right now, and eventually our data will be available to the public and to other researchers in different formats depending on its intended use. And so that is coming.
And I'll just add two things on that. Confidentiality is a key here. And I want to stress that it's not because we're hiding things that are like evil things. It's just that's the way that we need to move forward. This is something that instills confidence in producers that want to be part of the solution. And so you're going to have that. As far as what Lauren referenced with the data for Learn, you might just intuitively think, well, the data's there, let me see it, right? But the way the data is collected, little nuances to weather patterns and things like that. Just giving the data out, anybody then can start creating graphs and running analysis. But if you don't understand the full context of how that data was collected, what it can and cannot say, it becomes difficult. So the step has to be not only do you share the data, but this is what the data you're allowed to say with that data and what you're not allowed to say with that data. It's just logically and scientifically. So in the data space, I understand people are saying, this is federal and state dollars. This should be accessible to all. 100% agree. It's not that easy. And so I have confidence in our agencies and our academics and our farmers that it'll come out when we're making sure that it comes out and it's seen in the way that it was intended to be seen and not manipulated.
Also, scientists are humans. We're a group of like 40 to 50 people. People make mistakes. And we have systems in place to catch the mistakes and fix them, but it takes time to go through that process. And we don't want to post any data that has errors in it before it's ready for prime time.
Well said.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. That looks like all of our questions that we have now. So I launched that poll for the CLM credits. We got all those for you guys. Just a little promo for our next webinar. We have our Certified Livestock Manager series next Monday. We're going to be looking at cover crops, grazing cover crops, kind of the economics, the impacts on soil health, various cover crops that you can graze. So we've got several good speakers coming in for that. So we're really looking forward to that. And I am going to end today. Here's our water quality extension website, as well as our base email. If any of you have any questions, feel free to reach out to that and we can get you in contact with whatever your issue is. If you need any of the speaker contacts, feel free to contact me. I'm happy to get those for you guys. But thank you for coming to our final Water Quality Wednesday webinar of the year. And have a great rest of your year and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, Matt, for that presentation.
Yeah, bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Have a good one.
Take care.
Bye.